This is our third lecture, and in this one we want to talk about some of the initial things that are concerned with the translation of the Bible. The task of taking the Bible from its original languages into a second language is quite a task, and there are some features of that should be appreciated as we go into this. The earliest example of this is actually in the book of Nehemiah. When Ezra was reading the Torah, the people who had come back from exile from Babylon, and they had now come to Jerusalem and established a new community, had adopted a new language in Babylon, and that language is Aramaic. Many of them could no longer speak or read Hebrew. And so when Ezra is standing to read the Torah in the book of Nehemiah, the Levites then begin to translate his words from Hebrew into Aramaic that the people could understand. And so this was really the first example of translating the Bible. Now, this was not a formal translation, and so far as we know, they weren't writing it down. But nonetheless, they were doing the process of taking it from one language into a second language. One of the first things to understand is that in translating the Bible from one language to a second language, it always involves a certain amount of interpretation. There is no perfect way to move ideas from one language into a second language without interpretation. Interpretation requires that the translator have some sense of what the author is trying to convey in the original language so that he can try to reproduce that in the second language. And anytime ideas and thoughts move from a first to a second language, to some degree the reader is at the mercy of the translator. We might wish it was other than that, but nonetheless, there's no way out of this. The translator does hold a certain amount of interpretive authority in the making of this translation, because translators make choices. They make choices about words that may not be exactly the same in the second language as they are in the first language. Sometimes an expression in the first language is difficult to render in a second language because often expressions are idiomatic. And so translators make choices about how to best capture what the original writer is trying to say. All language is idiomatic. No matter where you go in the world, there are certain ways that different cultures and different people groups say things in their language that simply do not translate well into a second language because the second language doesn't use the same idiom. And so depending upon nuance and context, translations can differ significantly as translators try to recapture in a second language the work from a first language. And semantics and grammar, all of those things differ from language to language. Figures of speech are especially difficult, and because that's a particular kind of idiom that's unique to a language, often we don't know quite how to do that. For instance, if I say an American figure of speech that I bend over backwards, which for Americans simply means that I'm going to try really hard to please you. I'm going to bend over backwards to please you. But in another language, that may not work so well. They may scratch their head and wonder what's going on there. A story is told of Billy Graham, who was preaching in another country, and he used the unfortunate American idiom that he was tickled to death to be there. And his translator was somewhat puzzled by that and said that Mr. Graham had scratched himself until he died. It just didn't come across in the second language. And idioms are like that. One of the things about translating from one language to another is that it is sometimes easy to inject into the translation your own theological bias. And this is something translators must always be very careful of. This particular slide on the left of your screen is from the Wuest Expanded Translation, and it's from a passage about the famous man of sin in Paul's letters. And he says, "And now you know with a positive assurance that which, namely, the departure of the church, the saints being assembled together to the Lord, is presenting his," that is this man of sin, "being disclosed as to his true identity." Now, it's pretty obvious if you know the theology of dispensationalism that Kenneth Wuest is trying to protect a theological idea. He's trying to protect the theological idea that the church will be taken out of the world before the Antichrist or the man of sin is revealed in the world. And so in his translation, he puts in brackets extra phraseology that protects his theology. But those sections that are in brackets in this translation are not in the Greek text of the New Testament. They are rather reflections of his theological preference. If we translate it more straightforwardly, without this kind of theological preference, you'll get something like you read in the Revised Standard Version. This one simply says, "And you know what is restraining him now so that he may be revealed in his time." Obviously, this is much shorter, this is much more direct, but it leaves unanswered the questions that Mr. Wuest tries to answer in his expanded translation. So we strive toward neutral translations of the text without injecting into the text our own theological biases.